This is filthy. Are you blind? Helen, the janitorial supervisor, shouted aggressively at Jackson, the new black janitor. Jackson glanced at the polished glass. I just cleaned it, he said without hesitation. Without warning, she picked up a full cup of coffee and threw it across the table. The dark liquid splattered across the glass, dripping onto the floor. Helen crossed her arms, staring Jackson down. Now clean it again. As we delve into the story, if you believe everyone should be treated with respect, no matter who they are or what their color is, click the subscribe button now and tell us where you are watching from. It was an early morning at Kingsley Group, a multi-million-dollar company known for its success in real estate investments and high-end business operations. The office building stood tall on the city skyline, bustling with employees in crisp suits, carrying expensive briefcases, sipping on overpriced coffee, and working with an air of importance. A single motorbike pulled up in front of the glass doors, its engine cutting through the polished silence of the corporate world. Jackson Carter stepped off the bike, dressed in a simple polo, dark jeans, and a worn-out backpack slung over one shoulder. To the world, he looked like nothing special. But what nobody knew was that Jackson wasn't just some random visitor. He was the firstborn son of the company's billionaire owner, the rightful heir to the empire, and soon-to-be CEO. However, today, he wasn't walking in as the boss. He walked in as a nobody. 4 years, Jackson had been away, living abroad, building his knowledge, and growing into the man his late black mother would have been proud of. His father, George Kingsley, was a white man, remarried, and the company had continued running under his leadership. But Jackson had heard rumors, discrimination, unfair promotions, whispers that minorities were treated like second-class citizens in his father's empire. Today, he was here to see it with his own eyes. As he stepped toward the entrance, adjusting his backpack, he immediately felt eyes on him. Employees in designer suits looked at him with confusion. 2 receptionists, both well-dressed in corporate attire, exchanged glances. Entendere was Ethan Parker. Ethan was one of the senior managers in charge of operations. He was tall, stocky, with slicked-back hair and an attitude that reeked of self-importance. He prided himself on keeping the company's standards high, which, in his mind, meant ensuring only people who fit the image belonged. To Ethan, Jackson did not fit that image. As Jackson reached the glass doors, Ethan took one long, disapproving look at him. Then, with a smirk creeping onto his lips, he stepped forward. Hey man. Deliveries go to the back. Jackson paused. There it was, the first sign. He slowly turned, meeting Ethan's smug expression, and let the words settle. Now tell me, Jackson said, his voice calm, have you ever walked into a place, and before you could even introduce yourself, people already assumed you didn't belong? Drop a comment if you've ever faced something like this. Subscribe and like this video to enjoy more stories like this. Jackson could have said something right then. He could have revealed who he was, but no, not yet. Instead he smiled, a slow, knowing smile. Actually, he said casually, adjusting his backpack, I'm not here for a delivery. I was wondering if there were any job openings here. I'm in dire need of a job, sir. Ethan raised an eyebrow, looking Jackson up and down like he was something stuck to the bottom of his expensive shoes. The other employees chuckled, a few even whispering to each other, as if the idea of this casually dressed black man working at Kingsley Group was some sort of joke. Ethan folded his arms. A job, he snorted. You want to work here? Jackson nodded, keeping his expression neutral. Yes. I'm looking for an opportunity. Ethan let out a mocking laugh. Well, I don't think we're hiring, he said, turning away dismissively, already assuming the conversation was over. But Jackson didn't move. Are you sure? He pressed. I'll take anything, any available position at this point. Ethan was done entertaining him. With an exaggerated sigh, he gestured toward a nearby receptionist. Hey, check the system. See if there's something suitable for him. The receptionist, barely hiding a smirk, typed into her computer. After a few moments, she looked up and grinned. "Well, there is one position available," she said, glancing at Ethan. Ethan smirked back. "Oh yeah? What is it?" The receptionist let out a small, condescending chuckle. "The janitorial team is hiring." For a moment, the air was thick with silent amusement. Ethan turned back to Jackson, his smirk widening. "So, what do you say? You wanted an opportunity, right?" Jackson tilted his head slightly, as if considering. He could feel the weight of the moment, the stares, the quiet laughter, and their assumption that he was desperate. In that moment, he made his choice. With a calm nod, he smiled. "I'll take it." Ethan blinked. "What?" Jackson repeated himself, louder this time. "I'll take it." Ethan burst out laughing, and the other employees watched, shaking their heads, amused that this man actually accepted a janitor job. But Jackson didn't flinch. He just smiled. Because they had no idea what they had just done. They had just given the next CEO of Kingsley Group a front row seat to see exactly how deep their discrimination went. They had no idea who they were talking to, and soon enough, they were about to find out. Things were about to get very, very interesting. You would think that after securing a job, things would start getting better. But for Jackson Carter, the real test was only beginning. Imagine stepping into a place where everyone assumes you are beneath them. Imagine working in an environment where every word, every glance, and every breath is a reminder that you are unwelcome. Have you ever had a job where someone treated you unfairly just because of who you are? Drop a comment if you've ever been in that situation. Because what happens next in this story? Oh, it's the kind of injustice that will make your blood boil. And if you're already hooked, smash that subscribe and like button, because you won't believe what happens next. There he was, Jackson Carter, the secret heir to Kingsley Group, standing in a janitor's uniform, holding a mop and bucket. He had been working for less than an hour when it became clear he was not welcome there. The floors of the building gleamed under expensive chandeliers, polished by generations of workers who had walked these halls before him. But none of them, had ever been the CEO in disguise. Yet, no one in the building saw him as anything more than a janitor. And no one made that more clear than his new supervisor, Helen Taylor. Blonde, tall, with a sharp, permanent scowl etched into her face, Helen had worked at Kingsley Group for years. She was proud of her position, too proud. In her mind, she had power over the workers beneath her. And to Jackson, she made it clear from day one that she believed he belonged at the bottom. It started immediately. "You," Helen's sharp voice echoed through the hallway. Jackson, mop in hand, turned to see her marching toward him with a glare. "What do you think you're doing?" she snapped. Jackson glanced down at the mop, then back up at her. Mopping." Helen sneered. "Don't get smart with me. I don't like your kind thinking you can act all high and mighty around here. You kind." Jackson just smiled, wanting to see how deep this woman's disrespect ran. And oh, it ran deep. Helen didn't just dislike Jackson, she hated him. And she showed it every single chance she got. If he mopped a hallway, it wasn't good enough. If he wiped down a desk, it was streaky. If he emptied a trash bin, he was too slow. It didn't matter what he did, Helen found something to complain about. And she didn't just correct him, she humiliated him loudly in front of everyone. "Are you stupid?" Helen sneered one afternoon as Jackson finished cleaning the executive lounge. Jackson, calm as ever, set down his rag. "Did I do something wrong?" Helen rolled her eyes dramatically, turning to a few employees nearby who were already staring. "Did you do something wrong?" she mocked, laughing. "Oh, I don't know. Maybe the fact that you're still standing here after mopping like you're a 5-year-old? The employees chuckled under their breath. Jackson took in every single face. He didn't react, didn't flinch. Because while they were laughing at him now, soon they would regret every second of it. And just when he thought it couldn't get worse, Ethan entered the picture.
That's right, Ethan Parker.
The same racist manager who had mocked him on his first day. Ethan, who still had no idea that the man he belittled was about to own his entire future. Ethan walked into the hallway where Jackson was scrubbing the floors on his knees. "Well, well, well," Ethan said. Jackson didn't need to turn around to feel the smirk on his face. "Look at you," Ethan sneered, crossing his arms. "Guess we found the perfect place for you, huh?"
Jackson exhaled slowly.
Not yet. Not yet. He wouldn't reveal himself yet. This was about to get so much better. Ethan made it his personal mission to keep making Jackson's life hell. He walked through the halls, dropping trash on the floor right after Jackson had cleaned. He spilled coffee on purpose and demanded Jackson clean it up. He called him boy every chance he got. And worst of all, he did it all in front of other employees. Some of them laughed, some stayed silent, and a few, just a few, watched Jackson carefully. They saw something. Something about him didn't add up. His posture too confident, his presence too calm, too controlled, and the way he looked at people, it was almost like he was studying them. But still, the abuse continued, until one day Helen, that vicious supervisor, took it too far. Jackson had just finished cleaning the executive conference room when Helen stormed in. "What is this?" she snapped, pointing at the perfectly clean table. Jackson blinked. "It's the table." Helen scoffed loudly. "This is filthy. Are you blind?" Jackson glanced at the polished glass. "I just cleaned it." Helen's lips curled into a sneer. "You missed a spot." Then, without hesitation, she picked up a full cup of coffee and threw it across the table.
The dark liquid splattered across the glass, dripping onto the floor. Helen crossed her arms, staring Jackson down. "Now clean it again." Silence.
The room went dead silent. Everyone who had been walking by froze, their eyes widening in shock. Jackson inhaled slowly, then smiled. Now, the real show was about to begin. Because what Helen and Ethan didn't know was that their entire world was about to crumble. Jackson Carter had been playing the long game. He had been mocked, humiliated, and treated like dirt. They thought he was just a janitor. They thought he was beneath them. But what they didn't know was that he was about to become their new boss. When his father, George Kingsley, the powerful white CEO of the company, arrived, every assumption, every judgment, every ounce of arrogance in that building was about to be shattered. The receptionist's phone rang sharply, cutting through the noise of the office. She answered quickly, her voice professional, until her expression changed, a look of shock, then panic. Because the person on the other end was George Kingsley himself. The owner.
The billionaire.
The man whose name was on every single document in this company. And he was on his way right now.
Word spread trug the building like wildfire.
Executives straightened their ties, secretaries rushed to organize paperwork, and employees whispered excitedly. The big boss was coming in. But no one, was more excited than Ethan Parker. In Ethan's mind, this was his chance to impress the boss. Oh, he could already see it, shaking hands with George Kingsley, talking about company growth, maybe even getting a promotion.
And the janitor?
Ethan didn't even think about Jackson anymore. To him, Jackson was just a background character in his perfect little corporate world. But he was about to learn a lesson he would never forget. Then, it happened. The elevator doors dinged, and the room fell silent. George Kingsley had arrived. A tall, commanding man in a sleek gray suit stepped out, his face sharp with authority. His presence alone commanded respect. Behind him, his assistants, bodyguards, and senior executives walked with precision. As he stepped forward, every single person in the room stood a little straighter. Ethan puffed out his chest. Helen, the racist supervisor, adjusted her blouse, already imagining herself getting in good graces with the boss. Employees whispered excitedly. This was the man they had all been waiting for. George walked to the center of the floor, turned slowly, and smiled. Then he said the words that changed everything. "Ladies and gentlemen," George began, his voice smooth yet powerful, "today is a very special day for this company." People held their breath. Ethan leaned forward slightly, eager. Helen clasped her hands together, her eyes shining with excitement. "For years," George continued, "I have built Kingsley Group with the hope of leaving behind a legacy. A company that stands for greatness, success, and most importantly—" He paused, glancing around the room. "Integrity." A few people shifted awkwardly at that word. Then George smiled again. "And today," he added, "I am proud to announce that my firstborn son is officially here in the building."
Silence. A wave of confusion swept through the room. Firstborn son?
People glanced at each other. His son? The new CEO?
Ethan's heart started racing.
He had never seen George's son before, and neither had anyone else. The whispers began. "Wait, has anyone met his son? I thought he had a younger son from his second wife. Who is it?" Ethan's mind was racing. If George's son was the new CEO, that meant he had been in the office already. But where? His eyes darted around the room. Then in his mind it clicked. Of course. The only explanation: he had to be one of the executives, maybe one of the young white men in tailored suits standing quietly in the back, maybe the well-dressed guy from the finance department. Ethan smirked. This was perfect. A wealthy white guy as the new CEO. That was exactly how things should be. Helen, standing beside him, gave him a little nod of agreement. They had nothing to worry about. But then George spoke again, and this time, the words shook the entire room. "My son is already here," George said proudly.
"Jackson, come here."
Time stopped. Every single pair of eyes turned, searching. Ethan turned his head. Helen's confident smirk froze on her lips. Because they saw him standing there, still in his janitor uniform, still holding his mop, still standing right where they had left him.
"Jackson. Silence. Complete, utter silence."
And then Ethan's face drained of color. Helen gasped sharply, her hand flying to her chest. Employees whispered in shock. The man they had ignored, the man they had mocked, the man they had treated like trash, was their new CEO. It was at that moment that Ethan knew he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Today in this office, in front of every single employee, Ethan Parker and Helen Taylor were about to face the consequences of their actions. They had spent days mocking Jackson Carter, laughing at him, treating him like he was less than human. Never in their wildest dreams did they think the man they humiliated was the one who held their future in his hands. But now, the truth was standing right in front of them. For a moment, for just a moment, nobody moved.
Nobody breathed.
The air in the office was so thick with tension that you could almost hear hearts racing. Ethan, standing near the center of the room, stared blankly at Jackson, his mouth slightly open, but no words came out. Helen, standing just a few feet away, felt her stomach drop. Her face had gone pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. Because it didn't make sense. It couldn't make sense.
"Jackson, the janitor?"
No. No, that wasn't possible. They had spent the last few days belittling this man. They had made him clean their messes, spilled drinks, just so he would have to mop them up. Helen had even thrown coffee across the table and made him clean it right in front of everyone. And now they were being told that this same man was the CEO of Kingsley Group? No. It had to be a joke.
Sick, twisted Joker.
But it wasn't. Jackson stepped forward, his posture perfect, his face calm. But his eyes, his eyes were sharp focused. Because today he was done playing games. He looked around the room, watching as whispers erupted like wildfire. Wait, is this real? That's the new CEO? But he's been a janitor this whole time? Jackson's gaze swept over each and every one of them, as if silently memorizing their faces. And then finally he spoke. "I assume you all have a lot of questions," Jackson said, his voice smooth, steady, and filled with authority. The room was dead silent. Ethan, still frozen in place, blinked rapidly, his mind scrambling for something, anything to say. Helen looked like she wanted to disappear. Jackson let the silence hang in the air for a few seconds. Then he turned to his father, standing beside him with his hands behind his back, watching with quiet approval. Jackson nodded slightly. His father nodded back. And just like that, the room belonged to him. "My name is Jackson Carter Kingsley," his voice carried through the office like a wave, commanding everyone's attention. "I am the firstborn son of George Kingsley, and as of today, I am your new CEO." Boom. Just like that, the truth had been spoken, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop him. Ethan's entire body stiffened.
Helen lät auta stranglet gasp.
Employees exchanged stunned glances. Someone in the back let out a low whistle, as if they couldn't believe what they had just heard.
Jackson stod tal, unschaken, unbotert, untouchable.
Because for the first time since walking through those doors, everyone was seeing him for who he truly was. "For the past few days," Jackson continued, pacing slowly through the room, "I have worked in this building as a janitor." Murmurs of shock and disbelief spread through the atmosphere. "I wanted to see how this company, my company, treats people when they think no one is watching." His eyes landed directly on Ethan. Ethan gulped. "And what I saw," Jackson continued, his voice dropping slightly, "was not only disappointing but disgusting."
Ethan Parker.
Ethan flinched, his breathing quickening. Jackson took a step toward him. "You assumed I was a nobody.
You mocked me. Laughed in my face.
And you did it so confidently because you thought you were untouchable." Ethan's hand started shaking. He tried to speak, tried to salvage what little dignity he had left, but before he could, Jackson raised a hand. Ethan's mouth snapped shut. Then Jackson turned his head and looked at Helen. Her face was bright red, her eyes darting around the room, searching for an escape, a lifeline, anything.
"She found nothing."
Jackson tilted his head. "And you," he said softly. Helen sucked in a breath. "You threw coffee across a table and made me clean it," Jackson continued, his voice steady. She squeezed her eyes shut, unable to hide the shame. Jackson let the weight of his words sink in. Then he spoke one last time.
"Let me ask you something."
The room held its breath. "If you had known who I was from the start, would you have treated me differently?"
Silence. A long, painful silence.
Then, Helen nodded slowly. "Yes," she whispered. Jackson smiled. Because now the power was in his hands. For a moment, just a brief, agonizing moment, Ethan thought, maybe this is all a dream.
A nightmare.
Because this couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. He had spent days belittling Jackson Carter, treating him like nothing. And now, standing before him, wearing the same janitor uniform they had mocked him in, was a man who could end his entire career with a single word. Jackson turned slowly, scanning the room. His eyes landed on each and every employee, memorizing their faces. Some had stood by and watched. Some had laughed along. But one or two had shown kindness, and that would not be forgotten. Jackson had been watching everything. Then his gaze locked onto Ethan.
"Ethan Parker." Jackson's voice gut trug sie lengse like a blade.
Ethan flinched. His hands clenched at his sides, his entire body stiff with fear. Because he knew. He knew what was coming. But still he had to try. "Sir," Ethan stammered, forcing a shaky smile onto his face. I had no idea."
Jackson raised a single hand.
Ethan's mouth snapped shut.
"The thing about power?
You know when you've lost it." And Ethan had just lost everything. Jackson took a step forward. "Let me ask you something, Ethan," he said, his voice smooth, calm, and deadly. "If you had known who I was, would you have treated me the way you did?"
Ethan froze.
His mouth opened, closed, opened again. He had no answer. Because they both knew the truth. Ethan lowered his head. His voice was barely above a whisper. I didn't know. Jackson smirked. I know, he said simply. That was the entire point. Ethan hadn't been cruel because he was having a bad day. He hadn't been disrespectful because he was stressed. No. Ethan had belittled Jackson because he thought Jackson was beneath him. And that was something Jackson would never forget or forgive. Then Jackson's eyes moved to Helen. She had been standing frozen, her hands gripping the edge of her dress as if it was the only thing keeping her from collapsing. And now, those terrified eyes were locked onto his. Helen tried to smile. Sir, I was just following company policy, she blurted out. Jackson raised an eyebrow. Company policy? Helen nodded quickly, desperate. Yes, sir. I mean, I was just. Jackson cut her off. Throwing coffee across a table? Helen's face turned ghostly pale. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Because there was no excuse. Jackson let a moment sit. Let the weight of their actions crush them. Then he turned to his father. George Kingsley had been watching this entire thing unfold without a single word. His expression was unreadable. And for the first time in his entire career, George Kingsley was ashamed. Ashamed of what his company had become. Ashamed of the employees he had trusted. Ashamed that his own son had been treated like this by the people who were supposed to represent his business. And now he was about to set things right. George stepped forward. He looked at Ethan, then at Helen, then at Jackson, and finally he sighed. Jackson, George said slowly, what do you think should be done? Ethan visibly trembled. Helen clutched her hands together, pleading silently. And Jackson did not hesitate. Fire them. George nodded. Ethan Parker, he said, his voice calm but final, your employment in this company is terminated immediately. Ethan's knees nearly buckled. No, he choked. No, sir, please. But George ignored him. He turned to Helen. Helen Taylor, your position as supervisor is revoked. You are no longer employed here. Helen let out a silent scream. She spun to Jackson, her eyes wide with desperation. Sir, please, I didn't mean. Jackson held up his hand. Helen's words died in her throat. And just like that, it was done. Ethan and Helen had spent days humiliating a man. Now they were the ones with nothing left. But Jackson wasn't finished. He turned to the employees and then smiled. Not all of you stayed silent, he said, and at that moment, one employee stepped forward. It was Linda, the one person who had stood up for Jackson when no one else did. Now, she was about to be rewarded. Jackson turned to his father. My first decision as CEO, he said, is to promote Linda, effective immediately. Gasps of shock filled the room. Linda's eyes filled with tears. And just like that, balance had been restored. For days, Jackson Carter had watched. Watched the way they treated him, watched how they laughed, watched as they stripped him of dignity, believing he had none to begin with. Now, the truth had been revealed. Ethan Parker was gone. Helen Taylor disgraced. And the rest of the employees? They were about to hear the most important words of their lives. Because this wasn't just about one man's victory. This was about changing a system that allowed discrimination to exist in the first place. The silence in the room was deafening. The same employees who had once laughed, who had whispered behind Jackson's back, treating him like he was invisible, now couldn't even look him in the eye. Jackson stood tall, still in his janitor's uniform, still with that same quiet, powerful presence. But now, there was no one left to doubt who he was. Because today, he was their leader. Jackson took a step forward, then another. The weight of the moment settled over the room as he slowly scanned every single face. Then finally he spoke. Respect. One word, but it cut through the air like thunder. He let it sit there for a moment, letting them feel it. Then he continued. Respect is not something that should be reserved for a select few. It is not something that should be dictated by race, by class, by the way a person dresses, or the way they speak. Respect should be the foundation of everything we do. Because without it, we become exactly what we witnessed this week. A few employees lowered their heads. The guilt was sinking in. I have walked these halls. I have been invisible to you. I have been ignored, belittled, insulted. He glanced toward the conference room table, the one Helen had thrown coffee across. I have been forced to clean up messes that were created just to humiliate me. The weight of his words settled like bricks on their shoulders. He saw it, he felt it. But still, he wasn't done. And through all of it, I have learned one thing. He paused, letting the room hold its breath. The people who tear others down, they do it because they are afraid. Jackson nodded.
Afraid of change.
Afraid of equality. Afraid of a world where power is not determined by privilege, but by integrity. The air crackled with electricity. He was right, and everyone in that room knew it. That ends today.
You could tear a pin drop.
Because these weren't just words. This was a promise. Jackson turned to his father, the man who had built this company from the ground up, the man who had trusted others to run it, and the man who had just learned that some of those people had been running it into the ground.
George Kingsley nodded once.
He wasn't just looking at his son. He was looking at the future. Effective immediately, Jackson announced, this company will be implementing new policies to ensure that discrimination has no place in our offices.
Shock.
A few employees gasped, but none of them spoke against it. Because really, what could they say? Jackson continued. There will be accountability. There will be consequences. There will be change. Then he did something no one expected. He smiled. Because this moment wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about making people suffer. It was about building something better. This company will no longer be built on arrogance. It will be built on respect, on fairness, on the belief that we all rise when we lift each other up. And just like that, the entire company shifted. Because at that moment, they didn't just see Jackson as their CEO. They saw him as their leader. And for the first time, they knew this company was finally in the right hands. Jackson turned back to his father. George Kingsley took a breath, his chest rising with pride. Then he did something he had never done before. He stepped forward and shook his son's hand. A declaration.
A public acknowledgement. An unspoken truth.
This company belonged to Jackson Carter. And now, it was time to rewrite history. That is how you change the world, Jackson said, his voice steady.
Not with revenge.
Not with anger. But with power. Real power. The kind that doesn't just break systems, it builds something better. Do you think Jackson made the right decision? Should he have been nicer, or did he handle it perfectly? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you love this story, click that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. See you in the next video.